please take it away.
Thank you, Charles. So by way of introduction, until recently I was an independent consultant, but now I'm in recovery. I'm working for a London-based publisher. I mention that because this has nothing to do with my current employer. I wrote this paper before, and the alphabet soup at the bottom there refers to my involvement in standardization work, and I mention that because it shows where my interests lie. SC34 is the part of ISO which deals with document description and processing. So OO, XML, ODF, schematron. In terms of the subject, it's yet another case study of a data migration. We've all seen lots of those before. Some backstory is required for context, so please bear with me. But the silver lining is it's actually more about the solution that emerged post-migration than the migration itself. I hope that will come out. So the thing that needed migrating, this was a comparison product aimed at corporate lawyers, and it basically allows the user to compare and assess activity in the corporate law market. So, for example, there are transactions such as these things, mergers and acquisitions, reports from annual general meetings, initial public offerings, so when a company goes public. And as a corporate lawyer, that's useful information to you because you want to be able to assess which regions and sectors work might be available to you in, and its financial value. So where is the value in this content? Well, the source material is mostly available in the public domain because companies have to publish it for regulatory reasons. So you could, if you wanted to, find out a lot of it yourself, but some of these documents exceed 1,000 pages in length, and that it's an awful lot of reading and time-consuming. So the value add here is that an editorial digest distills this information and, with luck, allows querying across the transactions. For instance, and I'm not a corporate lawyer, so this is an artificial example, but you might want to know how many initial public offerings there were in the UK financial and banking sector last year as a sample query. So when this product first came to market, it left some room for improvement. There were issues with the editorial format and also with the publishing mechanism that took that format and made it available for sale. To dive deeper into the first of those, the editorial format, it was a legacy DTD. People still use DTDs. And it had been extended semantically to include useful things such as dates and countries, so as typed information, company names, industry sectors, transaction types. But unfortunately, because of, I don't know the reasons, but none of these were validated properly, so they could just be any old text. There was a named element, but you could put anything in there. And crucially, they were not coupled to the body of the transaction text, so they were just in a metadata header. So there's scope for error and also integrity of the information. So, time for some pointy brackets. There was hidden value in this data, so the information is mostly captured as two-column tables. So here we have one row, and essentially they're key value pairs. This comes from an annual general meeting report. So the key is were all the resolutions passed, and the value of that should be essentially a yes-no value. But for historical reasons of producing quite long-winded prose versions of the answer to that question, you get in the data something like 50 plus variants on this text, and the part I've highlighted in yellow there kind of makes it difficult for you to process that programmatically and get a sensible value out, because there could be apart froms and excepts and all sorts of things. Shading into natural language processing, which is, yes. But there was something good happened in that another part of the business adopted a third-party platform for its version of this product. So a new platform was made available, and that was backed by a relational database with data types, and there was a great hope that the data could be better compared. So migration work, that kicked off migration work to get from this very text-based, not very typed editorial XML over to something that was more amenable to comparison. And just a quick aside, why migrate? You might be thinking, well, couldn't you just rekey all this information on the new platform, just stick it straight into the database? Well, that would have been very costly and taken a lot of time. There was also the need to retain the editorial master in-house, because once you've kind of put all the information into this third party, I say again, system, then there's intellectual property issues. So we resolved to keep the editorial master and XML format in-house and produce what the database needed from that. And the third issue is that parallel support was needed for the old platform, so we still needed to generate the full text version, which didn't have all this nice new functionality. So briefly, the migration workflow looks like this. I'm not sure you can see the illustrations on the blobs. But over on the left, we start with the editorial XML. As I was just saying, at the top, the existing in-house pipelines produce the full text HTML for publication. So that's servicing the legacy product, and that appears on the new platform over on the right. Down below, the migration XSLT attempts to mine the information it needs, puts that into an XHTML document for editorial review, and that is backed by schematron. And that runs through the new publishing pipeline, which produces JSON, which is fed into the new platform backend. So XHTML was chosen because it was already supported by the editorial environment, so it was a quick win. And it was also consumed readily by the in-house pipelines. So to take a migrated example, so this is the format that the editors validated and reviewed once XSLT had pulled the information out of their previous version. All the fields are in a separate row in these tables, most key value pairs. Some have more than one value, but we can handle that. The class attribute at the top acts essentially as an identifier. It's not usually available to editors to tinker with, so that's a good thing. And it's used as a hook, both for the schematron and for onward steps in the workflow. And the schematron schema basically constrains what I've added in the second table cell there. So that's a date in this other namespace, foreign namespace. So we can validate that quite happily. The result of the migration was around half, slightly less than half of the fields could be migrated automatically. The good thing was that, having reviewed all this, the editors were quite keen to change the format that they were using. And you might be forgiven for thinking, well, isn't the XHTML just the format that should be used, really? Isn't that expressing the data model that we want? Yes, but not all of the information fits neatly into this model. As I said before, there's still the need to produce discursive and other variable text which has no real value being compared, so it doesn't belong on the new platform's back end. So there's other bits besides the stuff that you'd want to compare. And I mentioned before that the old pipeline still had to be serviced, so there was that. So any revised format would have to be based closely on the legacy XML format. So surprise, surprise, that's what we did. The new editorial format was enriched with inline elements, and they're constrained by schematron at the authoring stage. So it's what the editors were doing on the output from the migration, but just shifted back one step in the workflow. So they're now validating at the time they create the content. That's a good thing. So it's a significant step to be doing this, because remember, so far we'd only been using quite a permissive DTD. And another problem was that the CMS storing this content doesn't actually validate it on receipt. So for the first time, editors were responsible for ensuring that the content was structurally correct before you could attempt to, well, you could publish something that was invalid. So in order to support this new format, this new workflow, we needed essentially two assets: the editorial schematron that I mentioned, and also XSLT to take the editorial XML and turn it into the web pages. So faced with this, around a dozen content types more in the pipeline, we posed the question, well, can't we actually abstract this format and generate these two assets automatically? So that's what I did. And I was glad to hear the comments about relaxing, because it's a relaxing schema. It's backed also by a schematron schema. So this is the format that you would write something that configures the editorial format from which you generate your schematron and your XSLT. So at the top there, the root element transaction, that is refined by its type attribute. Below that, we have groups which model sections within the documents. Each one has a label, and each one has multiple fields. The field ID corresponds to the class attribute on the row that we saw earlier. So we have an identifier for each row within each transaction type. The occurs models occurrence indicators, so you've got some DTD-esque notation there to say how many of a thing you want. If you specify that data type as controlled list, then you can populate the attribute controlled list with the actual controlled list you want to use, which will be an external XML lookup. So you can constrain your values there. And is company name is kind of an artifact. It was a late-breaking requirement. That probably should be a separate data type of its own. It was just a way to quickly say, trim off anything in brackets after a company name. So in this diagram, I'm showing the workflow from the configurations that are written to that schema we just saw. And over on the right-hand side, the outputs from those, the two assets, the schematron at the top and the XSLT at the bottom. The only thing I would call out here is that apart from the configurations on the left and the XSLT boxes, and the other two bits that say they're handcrafted, all of it is auto-generated. So you only write what you absolutely need to write. So there may be some very specific concrete rules that you wouldn't want to automate or that you couldn't generalize, but the rest of it is a push-button process. So how does this work in practice? Well, to take an example close to our hearts, at the top I'm just taking a snippet, so this will be one row in a table, one field, and its identifier is favorite XML technology. It has a type of controlled list, and the controlled list I'm referring to is called XML technology, so this would be, as I say, an external document listing the allowed values, and I'm saying with the occurs that I expect at least one of these. And at the bottom, that would produce, or rather, that would be the editorial format for this. So you'd be editing a row with that identifier, the class attribute, and you would put in your one or more favorite technologies in the table cell below it. The XSLT to manipulate that looks like this. So the top template is generated automatically. The lower one is handcrafted. What ties the two together is the bit in yellow. So there's one of these lower templates for each of the data types and for whether there's a single or multiple occurrence. So this is a general template. So if you look, the mode data type is invoked for all the values, and it just places them in the right place in the HTML. So once you've written half a dozen or a dozen of the lower templates, then you can process pretty much anything you can configure at the top. And the auto-generated schematron, well, the handcrafted schema contains several abstract patterns enforcing the cardinality in the data type of most fields, along with a very few concrete patterns that are so specialized they wouldn't be worth generalizing. This concrete pattern will be applied to all rows with a class of favorite XML technology. So we select our class attribute and the which controlled list to validate that cell against. And you could be forgiven for thinking, well, the metaprogramming bit is all very well, but how can you check that it actually works? Well, of course, there was user acceptance testing of the schematron. We went through each data type, each transaction type rather, and editors made sure it was exactly what they expected. And the schematron for the XHTML output from the migration was still in place, so we could check that the auto-generated XSLT had worked as well. So, in summary, this was a data migration, but as I said at the start, we realized that a better capturing format would help. Also that the new format would need supporting assets, and that these would need maintaining over time. And following on from that, if this format were abstracted, then those assets could be largely auto-generated, meaning less upfront work and easier maintenance. And the conclusion in this case, that I draw at least, was that we got better quality and more consistent data. That's just a function of stricter validation, I guess. Fewer processing errors downstream. It was now not possible to publish something that was invalid, which was a step forward. The abstraction of the format does mean easier management and maintenance. If you need to run out the XSLT or the schematron, you just go back to those very simple configuration formats and edit those, rather than having to read code that others or you might have edited a long time ago. And as a rough guess, I totted up how much XSLT had been written to do the initial migration, and that came to about 5,000 lines. Doing it this way, it came to about 600, which still produced about 5,000 lines of XSLT, but you didn't have to write them by hand. And there was an estimate based on the migration work, which said that this piece, implementing the new editorial workflow would take between 8 and 12 weeks, and this cut it down to less than 4. So it was quicker, and it was smaller, and it works better. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Andrew. Do we have any questions?
Sorry, can I just clarify the model? So
Sure.
there's the scheme at the start, your relaxed scheme is the thing that describes the configuration document you could use to create those two XSLTs that then create all of the automated schematron XSLTs.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's the design of the schema and the configuration documents which are the keys.
Exactly. Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Okay.